Nein, die hupen wegen. Ah Gott, da in der Mitte.
Einmal weg, einmal weg! Ja. Einmal weg! Weg, weg, weg!
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Do I have some out-of-the-box theories for you? So we kick-started with Reza Pahlavi being approached by some maniac with tomato juice being thrown on his back, his neck, and the back of his ear. Well, we can talk about that. The reason why I showed that is I want to voice some opinions in regards to how I think the rest of this will go and should go. And from what I've seen today, because the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has made a statement to that effect, which pretty much resonates with what I wanted to say. However, there is something else here, a much larger play. Let me give you an analysis. And my analysis has to do with the fact that why the European governments and the European people, for that matter, are tending to seem like they're supporting the Islamic regime in Iran. This is a lengthy conversation, but I'll try and kind of summarize it for you very quickly. A very interesting thing happened after the Industrial Revolution. Most of you who are historian buffs will know that the Industrial Revolution, predominantly led by Britain at the time, although the Dutch weren't that far behind, had to do with coal. So coal was the power of industrialization. And this coal power continues all the way right up on pretty much the end of World War II.
We are now 765 yards below the surface of the Earth.
For centuries, coal was king, powering the nation through times good and bad, the force behind the Industrial Revolution, propelling Britain to the status of global superpower. That era now comes to an end as the UK's last coal power station shuts its doors for good. The closure of the Ratcliffe-on-Soar plant means the UK will become the first G7 nation to bring an end to coal-powered electricity, following through on climate commitments made by previous governments.
We're powering our country through an out-of-date, inefficient grid and ageing, polluting power stations. We need to replace the coal plants, invest in modern gas power and affordable renewable energy.
Coal's demise comes from a desire for clean energy, because coal is the most environmentally damaging fuel. When it's burned, it releases more carbon dioxide than oil or gas. And burning coal also creates small particles of soot and produces toxic elements like mercury and arsenic. In 2010, coal alone generated almost a third of the UK's electricity. You can see here on this yellow line that 13 years later, coal accounted for barely 1.2%. And you can also see a massive increase in the use of renewable energy sources like wind and solar in that time period.
But something interesting happens. There's a power shift here. And the power shift is because predominantly it's brought on largely because of the United States' involvement in World War II. So let me work through the chronology in a comprehensive and understandable way as much as I can. So bear with me. The United States entering World War II brought about a power shift. The power shift was because of the involvement of the US and because of the victory that was brought on with the aid of the United States, largely because of its participation. Many of the European countries were displaced from their power position. And the reason for this was, by and large, to do with oil. Europe had to move away from coal and had to move towards oil. Oil was cleaner, it was safer and cheaper, safer certainly in terms of accessibility. But there was something else here. So before World War II, all of the colonies that were formed, the so-called dummy countries in West Asia, what the British would like to call the middle of the East, they were largely controlled by Britain. They were certainly created by Britain. Britain at the time was controlling Benzina Pars, which eventually became BP, the Anglo-Iranian oil company. After World War II, things change. The United States insists on the fact that the European countries must forego their former colonies, brought about by something that was actually introduced in the League of Nations in the 1930s called self-determination plebiscite, whereby people living in a geographical location had the humanitarian and legal right to self-determine their own lives, hence self-determination. America was pretty insistent upon this, and this is why you have this escalation that occurs in the 1940s and 1950s with Britain losing its former colonies, India, and so on, and it loses its power base and power control in the Middle East. Certainly happens with France in North Africa, Vietnam, 1954, 1957, involvement of the United Nations, and then the Americans coming into it, the domino effect and all of that by Eisenhower. This power shift is very important. I want you to focus on this. Right now, as we are looking at events unfolding in regards to Iran, I want you to bear in mind that Europe doesn't have oil. Europe doesn't have gas. Europe has lost its political influence, and more so every day, it's losing that political influence. It is going to eventually lose out this war of power, because this war of power is based on energy. No energy, no power, no production, no factories, no innovation, and la-di-da, and so on. The reason why you have this green movement towards renewable energy, this is predominantly a European-driven project. It certainly is spearheaded mostly by the Europeans. And the reason for that is because they want this power shift to shift again. In other words, they want the power to come back to Europe in some way, perhaps not in the same way that it was in the Victorian era and certainly in the early 20th century. But for their own survival and stability, they need to have this power base return somewhat to them in terms of percentage-wise. So what they want to do is drive away the global dependency, certainly as far as Western democracies are concerned, the big industrialists, if you like. They want to drive away their dependency upon oil and gas. Why? Because Europe doesn't have oil and gas, so they can never compete fully in this field. And they obviously don't have the political inclination to re-establish that power base, largely because they really don't have much of a military in order to back it up with. So everything that you're seeing, all of these crises occurring, certainly after World War II, the Israeli-Palestinian argument, the North African argument, all of these backlashes that you're seeing, these are all part of a much bigger plan. Iran is a piece in this game. Saudi Arabia is a piece in this game. So is Oman, so is Bahrain, United Arab Emirates. We are just pieces in this game. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, wants this power shift to occur, but the other way. He wants the world energy dependency to go back to oil and gas, because there America is dominant. America has oil and gas more than anybody else. Its own industry relies largely on oil and gas, certainly population-wise as well. So for America, the regime in Iran is one of those pieces that needs to play in the favor of US policy. Now, this gets perhaps less complicated, perhaps more complicated. The European powers are not interested in regime change in Iran because they are using all of these mechanisms, let's call them countries, in order to further their plan for the decrement of oil and gas dependency, stepping into the realm of innovation of renewable energy, because that market they can control, that market they can be innovative in, and that market they can export. I personally think one of the reasons why the Democrats in the United States, for example, are also on board with this policy is because, unknown to them, or maybe known to them, they are inadvertently backing this European initiative, this European political policy. Of course, perhaps they're far removed from the fact that this will eventually somewhat diminish their global power. Perhaps they're not interested in that global power. But of course, it is an eventuality that will bite them in the rear side, because American global power, as a global power, is vital. The European countries are not interested in any pursuit whereby the humanitarian factor comes into the formula. And we can see this right now. To them, it's a game that needs to be played very carefully because they know that their sources, their resources is extremely limited. Most of Europe is four-seasonal. So for pretty much 6 months of the year, there's no agriculture in most of the European countries, with a few exceptions, southern Italy, southern France, maybe Spain and Portugal. But that market is not sufficient to provide the whole of Europe. They certainly have no gas, they certainly have no oil, they seems like they have no cobalt either, so no battery productions either. The Europeans are at a complete disadvantage in the current status of marketplace because we are an oil and gas based economy. From 1945 till, I would say, the end of the 80s, it was an okay market for the Europeans to compete in and to play in. But things have changed. It's not just about competing in these markets. In order to compete properly in any given market, to a certain extent, you have to have control over that market. The Europeans have been losing that control probably gradually since the end of World War II, and certainly more rapidly in the last 20 years. They want it back. And this is how they're playing this game. So the reason why you're seeing European countries not supporting this initiative that America wants to unfold for the world, this new economy, is largely to do with this. So it's the move from coal to oil and gas, which was okay because the European countries had certain control over the oil producing countries in the Middle East. As that wanes, they bring this renewable energy theory to the fore in order to lessen the US control of the markets and the industry, and they start to sell this idea to any corner that they can. Well, I mean, let's assume for a moment that the Europeans are successful and their energy efficiency program is adopted. Well, what happens to all those countries that depend on oil and gas? It would make them dependent upon whom? The people who provide the technology, the know-how, implementation, sale, administration, production, transportation, and so on. So we will go back to the 1920s to some extent. As far as world powers are concerned, America will become sidelined. It has its own economy, 350 million people, consumers, so it's got a good sale capacity there. It's big enough to sell to its own people. It has a thriving economy. It can choose to go oil and gas if it wants to. But it's not going to stop there. Because the Europeans wanting to control the markets isn't just their market. They want to control the global market. And that's why you're seeing this being pushed through the Democrats in the US, for example. I mean, look at California. It's immensely rich in oil and gas, and yet it wants to adopt renewable energy. And of course, the excuses and the rationalization behind it has to do with, well, the CO2 levels in the air are too high. Well, they're not too high. CO2 levels are at 0.04%. I mean, that's too low. What are we talking about? We're talking about shifting our entire economy, the way we live our lives and so on, based on 0.04%. But that's what they're selling. You see, if you ask anyone, what's the percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere? They don't know. You know why? Because they don't sell you this idea based on the actual science. They sell it to you based on the interpretation of that science, which are completely different things. It's one thing to talk about a number, but it's another thing to talk around the number, which is how they sell their argument. Anyway, I want you to bear this in mind, because I think this is an important insight into why politics moves the way that it does, in the directions that it moves. It has very little to do with what you and I would consider to be important and foremost paramount, and more to do with, this is just a game. And all of these countries are pieces in this game. Doesn't matter what the game is. They're just pieces that can be moved here and there. And you know, diplomacy is not about till next week. It's about the next 50 years. It's about the next 100 years. And that's why this game is being played this way. Anyway, I wanted to throw this out at you because I want you to understand that one of the reasons why I think, with my looking at history and connecting these dots, this is what I'm getting to. This is what's coming to me, rather, I should say, in that I see what's going on. This is not just about journalists asking the wrong questions or not caring about the 40,000 people that have died in Iran under this current Islamic regime. This is a much bigger game. And we, as Iranians, obviously are impacted by being Iranians. Of course, the larger game also impacts us too, but we are at the forefront of this game, the pawns, if you like. We're not the bishops or the knights or the rooks. We are the pawns. And that's why you're seeing this play out the way that it does. The United States, chiefly Donald Trump's political cabinet and his policy, is in support of liberation of Iran and the Iranian people. But it's a bigger game. It's about Europe and America. It's always been about Europe and America. Two great powers are always competing with each other. We are not that great a power in the world economy, even though that's our wish, and historically and culturally we certainly are endowed with wealth, but not necessarily with riches. So bear this in mind next time you hear the news. Crown Reza Pahlavi's outcries for the Iranian plight are not being echoed by the European journalists and European politicians. And I think in one of his interviews he even points out that one European politician said to him, "We don't think Iran is ready for democracy yet." You see, that is a riddle. That's secretly saying we're not completely sure if Iran is ready to be out of our clutches. You could look at it that way too. Iran is not ready for democracy yet. Well, which democracy is that? And what do you mean by democracy? Democracy from you, or democracy unto itself? Because again, those are two different things. It's easy to declare a country democracy if you hold elections, if you have a judiciary, if you have a constitution, and you seem to be following the law. But that's not what democracy is. Democracy is also about intentions and ambitions, and conduct, and how you treat your neighbors, and who you are in the region, and to the rest of the world. I think Iran and the Iranian people are very ready for that, and very suitable for it too. But the question is, are they ready to completely rid themselves of these European shackles that have been around in Asia since the time that the British were selling opium to the Chinese? And even before that, the cloth industry in India and how that was decimated by the British. Crop growth, wheat, flour, rice. Go and do some research on the sale of basmati rice from India and how that was completely and utterly manipulated in order to make more money out of rice that was being grown in India. Tea, coffee. A law is going to be introduced into Britain that anyone born after 2009 will not be able to purchase tobacco, hoping, the British government that is, that within a generation the sale of tobacco will completely be banned. Think about that. Why is that? Why is it that Britain doesn't want to sell tobacco anymore? Who produces tobacco? It's not the UK. It's none of the European countries. Most of the tobacco in Europe is imported from Asia or the Far East. Who cultivates tobacco? What kind of market does it dominate and control? How is it that they don't want to ban the sale of tequila if you were born after the year 2009, or vodka, or wine, or anything else for that matter? Where do these products come from? Who controls their market? Who benefits from the sale of, say, sugar, or the sale of tobacco, or the sale of petrol, gas in your car? These are some things to think about. Now, the other thing is that Reza Pahlavi's interviews, I am of the mind that Reza Pahlavi has to stop giving so many interviews. You don't need legacy media, and you don't need to sit in a room filled with 150 journalists in order to make your point. We don't. I don't sit in front of 150 people to make my points. It's not necessary to do that. I remember in the 1970s, I think Ayatollah Khomeini only appeared twice on television before he invaded Iran. I can't remember politicians back in the 70s giving this much interviews and so forth. What's the point? They're not giving him that platform so he can exercise and voice the plight of the Iranian people. They're doing it so they can trap him, so they can show him and criticize him, bring up the past and so on. His father did nothing wrong. Why is he on trial for his father's doing? What did his father do exactly? He imprisoned, 100,000 people according to Amnesty International, which turned out to be only about 3,500 people in Evin prison. And of course, as protocol would have it, every single one of those 3,500 people screamed that they were political prisoners. That includes burglars, rapists, robbers, killers, murderers, and so on, so on. So they all said they were political prisoners. Khamenei was one of them. He was one of those political prisoners in the 1970s in prison. Should we have kept him there? Was it right to let him go? It's that Hitler question, isn't it? If you could go back in time and meet Adolf Hitler as a young man or a young boy, would you snuff him? Or would you let history take its course? Interesting question, something to bear in mind. But I think Reza Pahlavi, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, should stop giving so many interviews. I think it's redundant. I don't think it makes the point. I think he can make those points by himself through all the social media platforms that's available to him. I mean, surely that's the point of all of this digitization, isn't it? It's a certain independence. It's breaking away from the constraints and shackles of controlled media by some editor. So that would be my advice to him. That would be my advice to all of his followers, that they should stringently press for this, because on this path something dark could happen to him, and we don't want that. That would certainly be a very unwelcome blot on the landscape, as it were. But I think these media people are just trapping him. They're just looking for an excuse to kind of vex him, so he says something that they can use against him over and over again. Oh, look, he does want to go back to Iran and become the dictator that his father was. His father was no dictator. How is it that the current Islamic regime in Iran isn't a dictator? You know, Angela Merkel, I want to jump back to what I was saying before. Angela Merkel gave an interview a while ago, not too while ago, quite recently, where she said, you know, we had no choice but to let all of these foreign nationals pour into Germany, because it was the only way that we could stop the far right. Of course, let me elucidate this a little bit. By far right and fascists and all of these words that people use, they don't actually mean those things. They don't mean far right as in, oh, fascist people who are anti-foreigners and all of that. That's not what they mean. That's a smokescreen. What that really means are people who want to revert back to the economy that we had, the oil and gas. Remember, that's paramount. Black gold. It's not called black gold for nothing. And you have to think of all the derivatives and the byproducts that we receive from oil and gas. So, you know, you will never be free of this. And why would you want to be? Oil and gas are natural products, the natural products of this planet. Why shouldn't we burn it and use it if we can do it efficiently and in a proper way, which we have progressed in the last 50 years in achieving that, in many multitudes. Plastics, certain resins, many other byproducts that come from oil, rubber. Your roads are filled with the residue of petroleum, tar, bitumen. They're not going to move away from it. What they want to do is shift the economy, the dependency of it, the seeming dependency. Who knows, you know, this is just another ploy, in my opinion. But I think you should bear that in mind. I wanted to kind of give you this little analysis as to why this is happening in the Western media and why it seems that they're so pro-Islamic regime. And it's not just Islamic regime. It's the longer game that they're playing. And they know that if they play it long enough, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, will not be there. They can play this game for the next 30 years and go through 10 presidents. It doesn't matter to them. They're willing to play that longer game. They have till now. They've been playing it for the odd 2,000 years since the time of the Romans. What's another 30, 50 years for them if it allows them to achieve their objective? But we don't have that time.